thank you all for having us here today and for taking the time to be here. So like Brad said, I'm joined here by got our whole accelerating restoration team here. And for those of you who don't know Sustainable Conservation, we're a nonprofit organization that works to advance the collaborative stewardship of California's land, air, and water for the benefit of nature and people. And I will share my screen again since that stopped. Okay.
Looks good.
Alrighty. So yep. Everything. Oh, well, okay. So like Brad said, the goals of this presentation are to provide some basics of permitting at the other agencies to prepare for more in-depth information in the future. If we went in depth on everything, we could be here for 84 years talking about it. And also to share some of the origins of these laws to give them some context. And we'll start with a bit of background about our program, and then I'll walk through some of the history of these agencies and these laws, what triggers needing a permit or compliance with these laws, some of these important restoration-specific permitting pathways that have been developed, and then examples of how they can be used together. And then we'll share resources from our program, and we have saved time at the end. So this is being recorded, and we're also going to share a PDF of the slides afterwards, so don't worry about having to take screenshots. And we're also going to share a document with links to our references and a lot more, so we won't be throwing a bunch of links at you during the presentation. Like Brad was saying, our Accelerating Restoration Program and others have been working in partnership with agencies and project proponents since the late 1990s to put restoration on a separate regulatory path from development to help increase the pace and scale of restoration in California while still providing robust environmental protections. And a fundamental reason our program was created is that these important environmental laws we're going to talk about were designed to stop bad things from happening and not designed to permit beneficial work in these habitats. And one of the tools that's been used to put restoration on a separate permitting path are programmatic permits. We're going to talk about those a lot today, so we just wanted to go over the definition. These have the terms and conditions spelled out up front for a wide variety of the most commonly done and highest priority project types. They can provide more regulatory certainty and be used as a planning tool for projects to save both agency staff and applicants time and money. And significant progress has been made, like Brad was saying, to develop these restoration-specific pathways and programmatic permits at both state and federal levels. So we'll show some of these throughout. So if you see a star on the slide, that means we are talking about a restoration-specific pathway. So keep an eye out for those. And this is what we're going to be covering today. Just a few things. We're starting with the Army Corps. And NEPA before we move on to the water boards and Coastal Commission. And then I'll hand it over to Katie to talk about the Federal Endangered Species Act, the Flood Board, and Section 408 of the Rivers and Harbors Act. So I'm going to start by taking it way back with the Army Corps to 1775. And the Continental Congress organized an army with the chief engineer and 2 assistants. This was to answer the question, why is the Army involved in wetlands? This seems a little weird. So in 1779, they created the Army Corps of Engineers. They were instrumental in battles in the Revolutionary War, including the final victory at Yorktown, which many people may remember because of the musical Hamilton. I include myself in that. And then Congress established the Corps of Engineers in 1802. And they've been involved in regulating activities in navigable waterways through granting permits really since the passage of the Rivers and Harbors Act of 1899. And it was really meant to prevent obstructions to navigation in the beginning. But then some 20th century laws gave them the authority over dumping of trash and sewage. And jumping forward in time with in 1972, the passage of the Clean Water Act and specifically Section 404 that broadened the role of the Corps to give them authority over dredging and filling in water of the U.S. or WOTUS. We will definitely be talking more about that. And the Corps initially attempted to limit its activities that were clearly navigable. They traditionally started with, but the definition of WOTUS has changed over time with different lawsuits. So this 1975 case, NRDC v. Callaway, imposed a broader definition, more than just clearly navigable, and to include wetlands. So now on to the Clean Water Act, and then I'll jump back to the Army Corps after this. But the originating legislation of the Clean Water Act was passed in 1948 after post-World War II industrial and urban growth that put a lot of pollution in our waterways, as you can imagine. But it was inadequate and ineffective, and some of you may remember learning about the Cuyahoga River fire of 1969. That river was so polluted with industrial waste and oil that it caught fire, and that was not even the first time that had happened. So you can see why there was a call for laws to stop bad things from happening. And, 1970s was a big decade for the environmental movement. One of the laws passed during that time was the amendments to the Federal Water Pollution Control Act that then became known as the Clean Water Act. So it expanded that law, amended it, gave direction for a new permit system, gave the Environmental Protection Agency authority under Section 402 and others. And it also made it unlawful to discharge pollutants from a point source into navigable waters without a permit. So you couldn't just have all these pipes putting all their whatever industrial waste into the rivers anymore without some sort of permit. So the Army Corps is responsible for implementing Section 404 of the Clean Water Act. And what triggers the need for a permit under that section is discharge of dredge or fill materials into waters of the U.S. And, we'll talk more about what's waters of the U.S., but wetland delineation methods, those can be found in federal regulations. There's delineation manuals and some regional supplements, and we'll share some links to that information in our document we're going to give afterwards. But some restoration-related examples of discharge, that could be things like placing sediment, spawning gravel, large wood, or, adding a culvert or replacing a culvert into or within waters of the U.S. And an important linkage is that Corps permit decisions are subject to other federal laws, such as the Endangered Species Act that Katie's going to talk about, and some others that we won't be covering today. Now, the traditional, the original way to comply with 404 was an individual permit, but over time, programmatic permits for Section 404 have been developed to make the process more efficient. These are called general permits, and they're issued on a nationwide, regional, or state basis for categories of activities that have minimal adverse effects. And to use a general permit, one has to comply with all the terms and conditions and requirements for submittal of what they call a pre-construction notification, or PCN. And that's the request that gets submitted to the Army Corps to authorize, yes or no, yes, this can be authorized by the general permit. And nationwide permits are a type of general permit. These are some of the main ones that get used for restoration, especially nationwide 27. General permits are usually valid for 5 years and then may be reauthorized for the Corps. We just wanted to touch on this because it's pretty important. The nationwide permits are in the process of being reissued. That's likely to happen March 2026 before they are set to expire. There's a proposed new nationwide permit for fish passage and some changes to existing ones. And one we want to talk about here is a proposed change to nationwide 27 that would say that a general description and a map of the terrestrial and aquatic habitat types and some approximate boundaries can substitute for a delineation of waters and wetlands and other special aquatic sites when a PCN is required. And this would be a really positive advancement. I would recognize that determining those precise boundaries is not really necessary for restoration because those activities are intended to provide a net increase in aquatic ecosystem functions and services. You're not filling it in and building houses on it. So the Corps in these documents about this proposed change acknowledges that the cost of preparing these highly detailed quantitative delineations can be cost prohibitive for projects. and it can use up funds that could be more beneficially spent to do more restoration. So that's something that was great to see. We hope that, gets issued with that in it. And one thing when we were doing technical assistance calls, we often have people look at the National Wetlands Inventory as a starting point for seeing what kind of wetlands and waterways they have at their project site. And then regional general permits are another type of programmatic permit available for 404 compliance. So of course there's RGP 12 and 78. Those are under your Fisheries Grant Restoration Program. There are more other ones, but just a couple. RGP 41, that's in the LA district for removal of invasive exotic plants, like arundo. That's an example I've seen it used for. And then RGP 16, that used to be limited to a smaller area, but it was reissued and now covers the entire Sacramento district, which is a pretty large part of the state. And it also allows conversion of waters from one type to another. So that was a change that happened as well. And it's coordinated with state and federal programmatic permits, which is another great thing to see. So moving on to another federal topic here, NEPA, that is the federal counterpart to the California Environmental Quality Act. And it requires federal agencies to assess the environmental effects of proposed major federal actions prior to making a decision, including decisions on issuing permits. And one of the reasons that using those Army Corps nationwide and general permits is so great is that NEPA compliance is included when you use one of those pathways. So that's another benefit. And then also some agencies have programmatic NEPA documents like the NOAA Restoration Center has for their programs. And Katie's going to talk about those programmatic permits a little later. And then some other pathways for compliance. There are categorical exclusions that, they're for certain types of projects. That's a more efficient pathway. Or if a CE can't be used, there's then an environmental assessment, and if necessary, an environmental impact statement, and that's the highest level of analysis. Just a couple other things on NEPA. There can be joint NEPA-CEQA documents for efficiency, and there's a handbook for doing that, and we will share the link to that. And then there are all sorts of other changes to NEPA that we just don't have time to, that could be its whole own webinar. So I'm going to move on to the water boards now. In addition to the Federal Water Quality Agency, that's the Army Corps, the state of California has its own water quality agency, the State Water Resources Control Board, and the Regional Water Quality Control Boards, the 9 of those, and that's collectively known as the water boards. And they were created by the Porter-Cologne Water Quality Control Act. And Porter-Cologne existed before the Federal Clean Water Act. Some of it was kind of used for the Federal Clean Water Act to inform what ended up in it. But it protects waters of the state, also known as WATS, and it allows the state to provide more protections above and beyond what's in the Federal Clean Water Act. And it's triggered when people do what's called discharging waste, some human activity that's putting some substances into water. So whether that's liquid like wastewater or it could be stormwater runoff from agricultural lands, there's a bunch of different examples. But in restoration, that pretty much means anytime you're moving dirt or adding any material to a water system. And discharge of dredge and fill to waters of the state is regulated by the water boards. So we're circling back to the Clean Water Act, this time Section 401, and that is triggered by a federal agency issuing a permit or license for an activity that may result in discharge to WOTUS. So that's an important linkage here between the Water Board and the Army Corps, as the Water Board certify that a federal action, like the issuance of a 404 permit by the Army Corps, is consistent with state law through what's called 401 water quality certification. So, most of the time, or a lot of the time with, aquatic restoration, there is that federal permit, and the 401 certification covers waste discharge requirements. So there's no separate WDRs to get. And then these are implemented by the regional boards, unless there's a project that crosses two regional board boundaries, and then it goes up to the state board level for approval. And an important document for people to know about, this is the 2019, when the state board adopted, with such a catchy title, the State Wetland Definition and Procedures for the Discharges of Dredged or Fill Material to Waters of the State, also known as the procedures. Long title, but very important. One of the reasons these procedures were developed is to strengthen protection of waters of the state that were no longer protected under the Clean Water Act due to Supreme Court decisions. Since the Water Act, the Water Board has historically relied on Clean Water Act protections during dredge or fill discharge permitting practices. So, in summary, California is trying to make up for where federal jurisdiction is shrinking. And, at this time, and, it's only changed even further, the definition of waters of the state is broader than waters of the U.S. So, especially with Sackett, things like ephemeral waterways, not really waters of the U.S. anymore. So, that's why the state is kind of a backstop for these changes in federal regulations and their shrinking jurisdiction. It's a very brief overview, but just, to talk about two important restoration-specific permitting pathways for Section 401. On the left, we've got the Order for Small Habitat Restoration Projects, unofficially known as the SHRP, that's been around since 2012. And as the name indicates, it's for small projects, and that's currently a size limit of 500 cumulative linear feet and 5 acres or less. And it's also only for voluntary projects. And, something else to note, it does not include WDRs right now. We are hopeful that the SHRP can be reissued with WDRs, and that can help with the situation with the shrinking core jurisdiction. That is something that water board staff are aware of. And then, but something helpful opens the door to HREA. And then on the right, we've got the statewide restoration general order that was issued in 2022. And that's a pathway for projects that don't qualify for the SHRP, either because of their size or some other reasons. Maybe it's a mitigation or, restoration as a result of an enforcement action. And it does include WDRs. So I'm going to talk about the Coastal Commission before I pass it off to Katie to talk about special status species. The Coastal Commission was established in 1972, and they work in partnership with coastal cities and counties to plan and regulate the use of land and water in the coastal zone. And local coastal programs are developed with local cities and counties and then certified by the Coastal Commission. So where is the coastal zone anyway? It is a legislatively defined geographic region along the coast of California. It does not include the San Francisco Bay, where I live, which is the jurisdiction of the San Francisco Bay Conservation and Development Commission, or BCDC. That's an agency we're not covering today. And how far inland this boundary goes changes along the coast, as you can see here, depending on where we are, where it's urban or rural. So you can go on the Coastal Commission website. They have maps of the coastal zone in each county for, survey accurate information and formal boundary determination. That's something people would need to contact the commission's mapping unit or a district planner about. And then the trigger for needing a permit here is development in the coastal zone, and that affects resources in their purview, which is a lot of things. It's water quality, habitat protection, but also recreation, public access, visual resources, and more. And development is also defined pretty broadly, including pretty much any restoration activity, division of land, changes in intensity of land use, public access. So a lot of things. I think that's the key point, is its development is defined quite broadly. And the majority of coastal development permits are issued under local coastal programs, except for certain places, tide lands, submerged lands, public trust lands. That has to come from the Coastal Commission. And then federal consistency determinations can be issued for federal programs as a permitting efficiency. And Katie's going to tell you about federal CDs with the NOAA Restoration Center in a bit after she talks about the Federal Endangered Species Act. So take it away, Katie.
Okay, thanks, Stephanie. Yeah, I'm going to talk a bit more about some of these cute critters here and protecting them, as well as areas where the state and the federal government have coordinated to make things more efficient without compromising any of the underlying environmental laws. And I'll also talk about what restoration specific or other expedited permitting pathways are available. So as you can see from the slide, there's a variety of fish, plants, mammals, and other types of creatures that are protected by the Federal Endangered Species Act. And on the next slide, you'll see some more details here. The law was enacted in 1973. So again, another law from the 70s. And it established protections for species, also provided a process to add or remove species from a list. And then it created the ability to make and implement recovery plans to try to get the species off of those lists. And then most importantly, like once a species or its habitat is on the list, the law prohibits take of species or its habitat with some exceptions. And in the federal context, take means to harass, pursue, hunt, shoot, etc., or attempt to engage in any such conduct like that. And then the state also has a definition of take, which I won't get into, but they don't specifically include harassment or harm in their definition. So projects that, after avoiding and minimizing impacts to the extent feasible, sometimes may still have the potential to accidentally take a listed species. And therefore, they would need what's called an incidental take permitting coverage, and as well as instructions spelled out on what to do if that take occurs. So in order to implement this Federal Endangered Species Act, there's actually two separate federal agencies involved, in case you don't know. On the next slide, you'll see that is U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service and the National Marine Fisheries Service. So I'll start with U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. They are under the Department of Interior, and they're responsible for plants as well as animals and their habitat, and some marine mammals, which I've listed here on the slide, just a subset of all marine mammals. Then you also have the National Marine Fisheries Service, or NMFS. It's under NOAA and the Department of Commerce. Apparently, there was some sort of political dispute when this was all getting decided between the president and the Interior Secretary at the time. So they've put these agencies under different departments, and multiple administrations have talked about combining them under one department, but that's never really gone anywhere. Now, there's two sections of the Federal Endangered Species Act that allow for compliance. There's Section 7 and Section 10. And I'm going to start with Section 7 on the next slide. Thank you. So Section 7 is a cooperative effort between federal agencies, and they cooperate to make sure that a project that's going to have a federal nexus, which I'll talk about, is not going to jeopardize a species' continued existence. So that you really want to avoid that. And so to use the Section 7 pathway, you'll need to have, or a project will need to have, federal agency involvement. That's like permitting. So things like using a nationwide permit or a regional general permit that Stephanie talked about, or funding, or even carrying out a project. So all those levels of involvement are called a federal nexus. And so when you have that federal nexus and folks want to use the Section 7 process, it's generally faster than the Section 10 process, as Section 10 doesn't have there's no federal nexus involved there. And with this process, a federal agency or the consultant they've hired will prepare information for the services to review. And that information can be in the form of what's called an informal consultation, when there's not likely to be adverse effects to a species, or you can have a formal consultation, like a biological assessment, biological opinion, where you're expecting to possibly need some incidental take coverage. There's also the ability to do a conference opinion, and that's in a case where you've got a species that's a candidate for listing. So it may be listed in the future, but it's not currently listed. But you want to avoid future delays in your project, so you want to do a conference opinion on that species. The Section 10 process, that's typically used when a project may adversely affect the species or their habitat, but there's no federal nexus. So if you don't have a federal nexus, your option is really the Section 10 process. It's often used by local governments, so cities and counties, and that's done to help simplify their permitting and also sort of funnel the impacts into certain areas and preserve other areas. So it also kind of serves as a planning tool. It can take longer than the Section 7 process because there's often public input as part of the development of a habitat conservation plan or an HCP and an incidental take permit. And then, as you might know, there's the state CDFW has an equivalent process to this called the NCCP. Sometimes you can combine the two, HCP and NCCP, and get one approval with both agencies. That obviously can take longer, but can have some efficiencies down the road. So in the next slide, I'm going to talk about some Section 7 processes that are more efficient and are specifically for restoration. National Marine Fisheries Service, they've used the Section 7 process to cover the entire state and the limits of Endangered for salmon and steelhead, meaning like up until you reach a dam or an impassable barrier. And these are implemented by various offices throughout the state. And in some cases, they've got measures protecting the species or work windows, areas when you can conduct the work that have been coordinated with CDFW as well, because as we know, CDFW also is charged with protecting some state-listed species that are also listed by the federal government and protected by National Marine Fisheries Service. So, I mean, generally here to use this process, you're going to have a federal nexus, like I talked about. Typically, that has been the Army Corps through their 404 permit that Stephanie talked about, and whether you're working in waters of the U.S. Now, as that waters of the U.S. definition and area is shrinking with the SACA decision and other implementation guidance, now folks may have to get more creative with finding a federal nexus, or other federal agencies might have to step up as the lead in order to be able to use these processes. But these programmatics have been used many, many times and have saved just so much time and effort on both the applicant and the agency side. And in addition to the programmatics, the NOAA Restoration Center also has developed a consistency determination based on their community-based restoration program. So they do NOAA Restoration Center. They're a non-regulatory arm in NOAA, and they have a nationwide program that does restoration. So they were able to prove consistency with the State Coastal Act upfront in advance, and basically create this separate pathway that's in lieu of a coastal development permit. So there isn't a public process, and there isn't the typical hurdles you'd face of just trying to get an individual CDP. So that's quite helpful to folks. And also this approval is aligned with those programmatics I just discussed. So more efficiency there. And then with U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, using what NOAA and National Marine Fisheries Service has done as a model, they've also created a statewide restoration programmatic for commonly encountered federally listed species that are predominantly in aquatic or riparian areas. And we provided technical assistance on this effort. The formal consultation they have, it's got 68 species, so animals and plants, and also covers some critical habitats. Again, protection measures were coordinated with CDFW for duly listed species. So the great thing about that is that if you have a duly listed species, meaning a species listed by the Federal Endangered Species Act and under California Endangered Species Act or CESA, there's some efficiencies to be had there because both the agencies were able to agree on how to best protect the species. And another great sort of feature of this approach to permitting and the Section 7 process is because the compliance has really been done up front. Once you've got a complete application form, the agency can sometimes issue approvals in 30 to 60 days. And previously they'd have 135 days or more. So there's just a faster process there. And then I'm going to talk a little bit about, I talked about the protecting species, but how do folks know whether or not there are actually, species at their project site? Where do you even start? So thanks to some information from Brad, as well as our experience, typically folks would start with the federal agencies, usually Fish and Wildlife Service. They have a great information for planning and consultation, or IPAC planning tool. So it's a website that allows you to highlight where you're working, and it will generate a list of possible species in your area. You can also contact NOAA staff to see what they suggest for their species. And then you can do things like a scientific literature review. There's CNDDB database, iNaturalist, which is sort of a crowdsourced database, eBird, and more. A bunch of ways to different sources of data you can pull on. And then you can also do something like, or folks will do something like assuming presence of a species at a site and just say, you know what, we're going to apply the necessary environmental protection measures, assuming that there are species here. So there's a couple ways to go about that, but this is generally how people determine whether or not they're going to need to comply with the Endangered Species Act and get some sort of coverage. I'm now going to move to the Central Valley area. So this is the Sacramento and San Joaquin valleys, and talk about the Central Valley Flood Protection Board, which is it's a state agency, but it's responsible for maintaining flood control, construction, and maintenance standards. So I want to make sure that the flood control system that they're managing continues to protect life, property, and wildlife habitat from flooding. So it's an important agency. They also have a flood plan that they periodically update. But essentially, the trigger here is if your project's in their jurisdiction, which is usually inside or near a designated floodway, you're going to need an encroachment permit. And oftentimes there's a core civil works project there as well. So you often will need a core Section 408, a letter of permission, and that's usually obtained through the flood board. So you go to the flood board, they will help you get the 408, but the 408 must be in place before the flood board can issue their encroachment permit. So as you can imagine, what we've heard from folks that work in this area is this can be one of the biggest challenges to permitting in this area because of this, the sort of two layers of approval they need, and also there's quite a bit of engineering work that goes into the review of projects to obtain this permit. And there is not a restoration specific permitting pathway with the flood board. although we, our organization did work with several interested parties in the Sacramento Valley area, and one of the big recommendations for that area was that the flood board develop some sort of restoration specific permitting pathway that would be more expedited from what they currently have. So fingers crossed something happens there in the future. But I will say that I'll talk a little bit more about this 408 letter of permission, because the Army Corps actually does have a more expedited process for restoration projects. So here, your 408 letter of permission, that's going to be triggered when your project or a project might be altering, occupying, or using, so not decommissioning, a Corps civil work project like a levee. And again, the Corps, the Corps also does 404 permitting, which Stephanie mentioned, and they typically work together to issue one approval simultaneously. In the Sacramento district, the great thing is that they do have what's called a categorical permission for environmental restoration projects that has a size limit, which you can see here. And that does have some advanced legal review and approvals. So it is a faster process. It still takes time, but it is faster than just your standard letter of permission. And then another thing we advise applicants to do, but we know it's also a solution, is the applicant could obtain a programmatic 408 for similar project types that they might be implementing. And then they won't have to go back to the Corps for each individual project that they might need a 408 for. So with that, Stephanie's going to take it back over and talk a little bit more about different examples using restoration specific permitting pathways together. So I'll hand it back over to you, Stephanie.
Thanks, Katie. So as we've gone over, there's quite a variety of restoration-specific pathways available, and this is currently the best way we have of showing many of them together on one slide, and including ones we didn't talk about today. But, and Katie mentioned it, and I just want to emphasize again, we've got these starred, how important it is to have so many of these pathways with coordinated conditions and protection measures, and how that these things are designed to work well together, like these programmatics with cutting green tape tools. So, it's been a great advancement overall in permitting. And, one of the reasons we want to make you all aware of these things is how well they can be used with the permitting pathways that you all manage. And just kind of, breaking this down a little more. On the left in the green box, we have the kind of the ultimate combination of for small scale projects. So 5 acres or less for that categorical exclusion. And then also the 500 cumulative linear feet or less for the SHRP and HREA. And when we talk to project proponents, one of the first questions we ask is about project size and, eligibility for these things. And if this is something they're eligible for, that's, what people would typically use. And then the things in the center, mainly these PBOs with the federal agencies and these federal consistency determinations, as well as these programmatics with the Corps. Those can be used, for smaller projects. And in most cases, with the pathways on the right that are, mostly used, were designed for larger projects, but, there's no minimum size. But it's great to have these, for all these options and pathways that can all be used in various combinations together for larger projects. It's a great thing to have all these options and to make it easier to get larger projects done. And because there are so many different pathways and so much more we couldn't even talk about today, that's why we took our, what had been a table, this essential guide, and we turned it into a whole website. That's acceleratingrestoration.org. It's got a lot more details about each pathway, all kinds of links, permitting tips, and much more. And people can also contact us at restoration@suscon.org for free technical assistance. That's how you email all 3 of us at once. And we've gotten some referrals from the Cutting Green Tape team, and we were happy to take those on. Since I mentioned example projects, here's our kind of our map of what we have so far on our website. It helps to show different ways permitting pathways can be used together. Sometimes we even refer to these and look at them while we're on technical assistance calls. I'm continually adding projects to this website, so if you think of some other ones that you think would be a great example, feel free to let me know. On this website, we try to include permitting documents and helpful tips, things that could help other people who are trying to do something similar. And this South Fork 10 Mile River project, phase 2 is just an interesting example also of a permitting situation that I'll talk about next. And that's the scenario we've seen actually several times where there's a project that is 5 acres or less, so qualifies for this Cat X, that doesn't have a linear foot limit, but it's over the linear foot limit to use the Sherpa HREA. So it's using a combination of these things that's a little different, but we've seen it quite a few times. And that project also used, both of these PBOs, and it was in the coastal zone, so it used that federal consistency determination. And more details about the permitting for that project are on that example webpage. We also have our Sacramento River Basin permitting roadmap. That's got an overview of the permitting process. That part could apply to anywhere in the state. And then one of the most useful things is this flow chart. It's chock full of tips and information, really walks through a series of questions to guide the user into what permitting, what permits you're triggering the need for, what are your different options. And I want to thank the Cut and Green Tape team for their review of the CDFW related sections. And I'm working on a statewide version that's going to have the Coastal Commission and any other things that aren't in this one. And I'm planning to have that done before the end of the year. And another resource we've talked about protection measures a lot, and there's a lot of them. So we worked to develop this tool. It's meant to use as an initial screening tool to help applicants, project proponents select their measures for restoration projects from this whole bunch of permitting pathways. And then it gives them spreadsheets that they can download and edit. And I've shared all the measures from this web tool with the Cut and Green Tape team, so you can use them when putting together restoration management permits and really have that coordinated permitting across agencies. And we will update this tool if and when there are any changes to any of these permitting pathways. And to stay up to date on all these things, including that statewide roadmap, you can sign up for our email newsletter. I promise I will not spam you, but there are, all kinds of changes that we're tracking. And this is our main way of sharing that information with the restoration community. And with that, I want to thank you all for having us, and thank the Coastal Conservancy, foundations, and individuals who fund our outreach work. And now, let's see, I'll stop the slideshow and stop screen share so I can see you all, and we'll take questions.